Hello and welcome back. Thank you for joining us. If you were with us in our last video, we read chapters 1 through 3, and I asked you to pay really close attention to the setting, the characters, and the events that were introduced throughout those chapters. So I want to talk quickly about each of those things. We learned that something interesting about Camp Green Lake is that there's actually no lake there anymore. It talks about Camp Green Lake in two different timelines, right? So it talks about Camp Green Lake 100 years ago, and 100 years ago it says it's actually the largest lake in Texas. And it had a town with people that were there, but it goes on to say that in current times, the lake and the people have dried up, right? So Camp Green Lake in present times is pretty barren. There are only 2 trees there, right? And the hammock where the lake used to be that can provide shade. It gets pretty hot at Camp Green Lake. It says that the temperatures are about 95 degrees during the summer days, which is pretty hot. But it also goes on to talk about the animals that live there. Some of the first animals that we're introduced to are the scorpions and the rattlesnakes. Now those seem like pretty dangerous animals, but the text says that those aren't what you need to be worried about. The animal that you need to be worried about is the yellow-spotted lizard. The yellow-spotted lizard is very dangerous, and the text says if you get bitten by one of these yellow-spotted lizards, then you might as well just lay there because there's nothing anybody can do for you. One of the next things that I want to talk about are the characters. We were introduced to Stanley, who's going to be our main character throughout this book. Stanley, we learn, is a larger kid, maybe, right? He was bullied for his size, but he also describes himself and his family as being quite hopeful. We're then introduced to Stanley's father, which is Stanley Yelnats the third, right? So there's several generations of Stanley Yelnats. And his father is an inventor. It describes him as having perseverance, and it says that he's very smart as well. Throughout the text, it goes on to talk about his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. His dirty, no good, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather is who they blame for the family being cursed, right? It talks about how the family doesn't really have good luck, they're cursed, and that's because his great-great-grandfather stole a pig from this one-legged gypsy. Now, this one-legged gypsy didn't like that, so she placed a curse on his great-great-grandfather and then all of his descendants after him. Another character that we're introduced to that I want you to pay attention to is Kissing Kate Barlow. So Kissing Kate Barlow, we learn, is not a very good person. She's an outlaw, and she's known for killing the people that she kisses. Something interesting, a connection that we can make between Kissing Kate Barlow and Stanley's family, is that Stanley's great-grandfather, who's considered to be more lucky than the other Yelnats, actually got robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow, right? But he was lucky because she didn't kill him. That was because she didn't kiss him. I also want to mention, in addition to the setting that we talked about and the characters, your pre-reading activity asked you to talk about some traditions and history that your family has. Throughout the first 3 chapters of the book, we learned that Stanley's family has some beliefs and traditions. One of the beliefs that they hold is that they believe that their bad luck is due to this curse, right, placed on them by the one-legged gypsy. Another thing that we learn is that they have this interesting lullaby. Stanley recalls a time when his dad sang to him, right? And it was a lullaby that his family has passed down from generation to generation. So moving forward, today we're going to read through chapters 4 through 6. And throughout 4 and 5, what our focus is going to be, our I can statement, I want you to be able to refer to details and examples when explaining what the text says explicitly and when drawing inferences. So your questions for chapter 4, I'm not going to mention chapter 5, but those are all in your slides, and I do want you to answer those even if I don't mention them. Your consider this is explain the daily process of digging holes. And I also want you to answer, why doesn't Camp Green Lake have any fences or guards? So we're paying close attention to those two questions for chapter 4. Your questions for chapter 5 are in your packet. Your I can statement is the same for both of those. Let's begin reading. Chapter 4. Stanley felt somewhat dazed as the guard unlocked his handcuffs and led him off the bus. He'd been on the bus for over 8 hours. "Be careful," the bus driver said as Stanley walked down the steps. Stanley wasn't sure if the bus driver meant for him to be careful going down the steps or if he was telling him to be careful at Camp Green Lake. "Thanks for the ride," he said. His mouth was dry and his throat hurt. He stepped onto the hard, dry dirt. There was a band of sweat around his wrist where the handcuff had been. The land was barren and desolate. He could see a few rundown buildings and some tents. Farther away, there was a cabin beneath 2 tall trees. Those 2 trees were only plant life he could see. There weren't even weeds. The guard led Stanley to a small building. A sign in front of it said, "You are entering Camp Green Lake Juvenile Correctional Facility." Next to it was another sign which declared that it was a violation of the Texas Penal Code to bring guns, explosives, weapons, drugs, or alcohol into the premises. As Stanley read the sign, he couldn't help but think, well, duh. The guard led Stanley into the building, where he felt the welcome release of air conditioning. A man was sitting with his feet up at the desk. He turned his head when Stanley and the guard entered, but otherwise didn't move. Even though he was inside, he wore sunglasses and a cowboy hat. He also held a can of soda, and the sight of it made Stanley even more aware of his own thirst. He waited while the bus guard gave the man papers to sign. "That's a lot of sunflower seeds," the bus guard says. Stanley noticed a burlap sack filled with sunflower seeds on the floor next to his desk. "I quit smoking last month," said the man in the cowboy hat. He had a tattoo of a rattlesnake on his arm, and as he signed his name, the snake's rattle seemed to wiggle. "I used to smoke a pack a day. Now I eat a sack of these every week." The guard laughed. There must have been a small refrigerator behind his desk, because the man in the cowboy hat produced 2 more cans of soda. For a second, Stanley hoped that one might be for him, but the man gave one to the guard and said the other was for the driver. 9 hours here, and now 9 hours back, the guard grumbled. What a day. Stanley thought about the long, miserable bus ride and felt a little sorry for the guard and the bus driver. The man in the cowboy hat spit sunflower seeds into a waste paper basket. Then he walked around a desk to Stanley. "My name is Mr. Sir," he said. "Whenever you speak to me, you must call me by name. Is that clear?" Stanley hesitated. Yes, Mr. Sir," he said, though he couldn't imagine that was really his name. "You're not in the Girl Scouts anymore," Mr. Sir said. Stanley had to remove his clothes in front of Mr. Sir, who made sure he wasn't hiding anything. He was then given 2 sets of clothes and a towel. Each set consisted of a long-sleeve orange jumpsuit, an orange t-shirt, and yellow socks. Stanley wasn't sure if the socks had been yellow originally. He was also given white sneakers, an orange cap, and a canteen made of heavy plastic, which unfortunately was empty. The cap had a piece of cloth sewn to the back of it for neck protection. Stanley got dressed. The clothes smelled like soap. Mr. Sir told him he should wear 1 set to work and 1 set for relaxation. Laundry was done for every 3 days. On that day, his work clothes would be washed. Then the other set would become his work clothes, and he would get clean clothes to wear while resting. "You are to dig 1 hole each day, including Saturdays and Sundays. Each hole must be 5 feet deep and 5 feet across in every direction. Your shovel is your measuring stick. Breakfast is served at 4:30. Stanley must have looked surprised because Mr. Sir went on to explain that they started early to avoid the hottest part of the day. No one is going to babysit you, he added. The longer it takes you to dig, the longer you will be out in the sun. If you dig up anything interesting, you are to report it to me or any other counselor. When you finish, the rest of the day is yours. Stanley nodded to show he understood. This isn't Girl Scout camp, said Mr. Sir. He checked Stanley's backpack and allowed him to keep it. Then he led Stanley outside into the blazing heat. Take a good look around you, Mr. Sir said. What do you see? Stanley looked out across the vast wasteland. The air seemed thick with heat and dirt. Not much, he said, then hastily added, Mr. Sir. Mr. Sir laughed. You see any guard towers? No. How about any electrical fence? No, Mr. Sir. There's no fence at all, is there? No, Mr. Sir. You want to run away? Mr. Sir asked him. Stanley looked back at him, unsure of what he meant. If you want to run away, go ahead. Start running. I'm not going to stop you. Stanley didn't know what kind of game Mr. Sir was playing. If you're looking at my gun, don't worry. I'm not going to shoot you. He taped his holster. This is for yellow-spotted lizards. I wouldn't waste a bullet on you. I'm not good to run away, Stanley said. Good thinking, said Mr. Sir. Nobody runs away from here. We don't need a fence. You know why? Because we've got the only water for 100 miles. You want to run away? You'll be buzzard-flued in 3 days. Stanley could see some kids dressed in orange and carrying shovels dragging themselves toward the fence. You thirsty? Asked Mr. Sir. Yes, Mr. Sir, Stanley said gratefully. Well, you better get used to it. You're going to be thirsty for the next 18 months. Chapter 5. There were 6 large gray tents, and each one had a black letter on it. A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counselors slept in F. Stanley was assigned to the D tent. Mr. Pendensky was his counselor. My name is easy to remember, said Mr. Pendensky as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. 3 easy words. Pen, dance, key. Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Pendensky was younger than Mr. Sir and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close that it was almost bald. But his face was covered in thick curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. Mr. Sir isn't really so bad, said Mr. Pendensky. He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you've got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake. Don't upset the warden. Stanley nodded, as if he understood. I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you, Mr. Pendensky said. I understand you've made some bad mistakes in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You may have done some bad things. That doesn't mean you're a bad kid. Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try and tell this counselor that he was innocent. He figured that everyone probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendensky to think he had a bad attitude. I'm going to help you turn your life around, said the counselor, but you're going to have to help too. Can I count on your help? Yes, sir, Stanley said. Mr. Pendensky said, good, and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendensky called to them, Rex, Alan, I want you to come say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team. The boys glanced wearily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat, and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other was black. What happened to Barf Bag? Asked the black kid. Lewis is still in the hospital, said Mr. Pendensky. He won't be returning. He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hand and introduce themselves, like gentlemen. Hi, the white kid grunted. That's Alan, said Mr. Pendensky. My name is not Alan, the boy said. It's Squid, and that's X-Ray. Hey, said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could see out of them. Mr. Pendenski told Alan to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. Then he led them inside the tent. There were 7 cots. Each one lay less than 2 feet from the one to the next. Which was Lewis's cot? Mr. Pendenski asked. Barf Bag slept there, said X-Ray, kicking at one of the beds. All right, Stanley, that'll be yours, said Mr. Pendenski. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He was particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by somebody named Barf Bag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles at one side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and towel in what used to be Barf Bag's crate. It was the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Pendenski as Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. They all have nicknames, explained Mr. Pendenski. However, I prefer to use those names their parents gave them, the names that society will recognize them by when they return to become useful and hardworking members of society. It ain't just a nickname, X-Ray told Mr. Pendenski. He tapped the rim of his glasses. I can see inside you, Mom. You've got a big, fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Pendenski and X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name's Zero? Asked Mr. Pendenski. Because there's nothing inside of his head. He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, a boy said. Mr. Pendenski smiled at him. If it makes you feel better to call me Mom, Theodore, go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm depending on you. Theodore spit in a thin line of saliva beneath his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. You were all new here once, said Mr. Pendenski, and if you all know what it feels like, I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pendenski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left home, but he was so thirsty he felt as if he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him. Do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley by his collar. My name's not Theodore, he said. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared up at him, terrified. There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower stall. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, he couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little better about having slept in a cot that had been used by somebody named Barf Bag. Maybe it was a term of respect. So I'm going to pause here. Go ahead and take a moment. You can pause to add to your character chart. We've been introduced to some new characters, and then you can also respond to those questions before we move on to Chapter 6. Chapter 6, we have a different focus. I want you to focus on summarizing your I can statement as I can write a summary using details from the text. I want you to summarize the event that got Stanley sent to Camp Green Lake. And then also consider this. Why don't the boys believe Stanley when he told them that he stole the sneakers? Okay, so that's going to be our focus for this chapter, Chapter 6. We're working on summaries. Stanley took a shower, if you could call it that, ate dinner, if you could call it that, and went to bed, if you could call his smelly and scratchy cot a bed. Because of the scarcity of water, each camper was only allowed a 4-minute shower. It took Stanley nearly that long to get used to the cold water. There was no knob for hot water. He kept stepping into, then jumping back from, the spray until the water shut up automatically. He never managed to use a bar of soap, which just meant as well because he wouldn't have had time to rinse off all the suds. Dinner was some kind of stewed meat and vegetables. The meat was brown and the vegetables had once been green. Everything tasted pretty much the same. He ate it all, and he used a slice of white bread to mop up the juice. Stanley had never been one to leave food on his plate, no matter how it tasted. "What'd you do?" one of the campers asked him. At first, Stanley didn't know what he meant. "They sent you here for a reason." "Oh," he realized, "I stole a pair of sneakers." The other boys thought that was funny. Stanley wasn't sure why. Maybe because their crimes were a lot worse than stealing shoes? "From a store, or where? Were they on someone's feet?" asked Wood. Neither," Stanley answered. "They belonged to Clyde Livingston." Nobody believed him. "Sweet feet," said X-Ray. "Yeah, right." "No way," said Squid. Now, as Stanley lay on his cot, he thought it was kind of funny in a way. Nobody had believed him when he said he was innocent. Now, when they had stolen from him, when he said he stole them, nobody believed him either. Clyde Sweet Feet Livingston was a famous baseball player. He'd led the American League in stolen bases over the last 3 years. He was also the only player in history to ever hit 4 triples in one game. Stanley had a poster of him hanging on the wall of his bedroom. He used to have a poster anyway. He didn't know where it was now. It had been taken by the police and was used as evidence as guilt in the courtroom. Clyde Livingston also came to court. In spite of everything, when Stanley found out that Sweet Feet was going to be there, he was actually excited about the prospect of meeting his hero. Clyde Livingston testified that they were his sneakers and that he donated them to help raise money for the homeless shelter. He said he couldn't imagine what kind of horrible person would steal from homeless children. That was the worst part for Stanley. His hero thought he was a no-good, dirty, rotten thief. As Stanley tried to turn over his cot, he was afraid it was going to collapse under all his weight. He barely fit in. When he finally managed to roll over his stomach, the smell was so bad that he turned over again and tried sleeping on his back. The cot smelled like sour milk. Though it was night, the air was still very warm. Armpit was snoring at 2 cots away. Back to school, a bully named Derek Doon used to torment Stanley. The teachers never took Stanley's complaints seriously because Derek was so much smaller than Stanley. Some teachers even seemed to find it amusing that a little kid like Derek could pick on someone as big as Stanley. On the day that Stanley was arrested, Derek had taken Stanley's notebook and, after a long game of come and get it, finally dropped it in the toilet in the boys' restroom. By the time Stanley retrieved it, he missed his bus and had to walk home. It was while he was walking home, carrying his wet notebook with the prospect of having to copy his ruined pages, that the sneakers fell from the sky. "I was walking home and the sneakers fell from the sky," he had told the judge. "One hit me in the head." It had hurt, too. They hadn't exactly fallen from the sky. He had just walked out from under a freeway overpass when the shoe hit him on the head. Stanley took it as some kind of sign. His father had been trying to figure out a way to recycle old sneakers, and suddenly a pair of sneakers fell on top of him, seemingly out of nowhere, like a gift from God. Naturally, he had no way of knowing they belonged to Clyde Livingston. In fact, the shoes were anything but sweet. Whoever had worn them had bad case of foot odor. Stanley couldn't help but think that there was something special about those shoes, that they would somehow provide the key to his father's invention. It was so much of a coincidence to be a mere accident. Stanley had felt like he was holding Destiny's shoes. He ran. Thinking back now, he wasn't sure why he ran. Maybe he was in a hurry to bring the shoes to his father, or maybe he was trying to run away from his miserable, humiliating day at school. A patrol car pulled alongside him. A policeman asked why he was running. Then he took the shoes and made a call on his radio. Shortly thereafter, Stanley was arrested. It turned out that the sneakers had been stolen from a display at the homeless shelter. That evening, rich people were going to come to the shelter and pay hundreds of dollars to eat the food that poor people ate every day for free. Clyde Livingston, who had once lived at the shelter when he was younger, was going to speak and sign autographs. His shoes would be auctioned, and it would be expected that they would sell over sell for over $5,000. All that money would go to help the homeless. Because of the baseball schedule, Stanley's trial was delayed several months. His parents couldn't afford a lawyer. "You don't need a lawyer," his mother said. "Just tell them the truth." Stanley told the truth, but perhaps it would have been better if he had lied a little. He could have said he found the shoes in the street. No one believed they fell from the sky. It wasn't destiny, he realized. It was his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. The judge called Stanley's crime despicable. The shoes were valued at over $5,000. It was money that would provide food and shelter for the homeless. And you stole that from them, just so you could have a souvenir. The judge said that there was an opening at Camp Green Lake, and he suggested that the discipline of the camp might improve Stanley's character. It was either that or jail. Stanley's parents asked if they could have some time to find out more about Camp Green Lake, but the judge advised them to make a quick decision. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. And that is the end of chapter 7. So when you get done with this video, I want you to answer those questions, but please make sure that you are using your SWBST method for your summary. So somebody wanted, but, so, and then. Make sure that you are using that as kind of a skeleton to fill in the holes there. I will see you next time.